Welcome to this meeting of Catalan municipalities to talk about the time use reform. We'll do our best to explain what time use policies are all about, especially right now at a time in which a lot of things are changing in our society. That is why we will have very special guests. They're all representatives of several municipalities in Catalonia, as well as the city of Besain in the Basque Country. Now, without further ado, I believe that it is important to tell you right up front that time use policies uh, tend to appear with economic and demographic changes at the end of the 80s and 90s of the past century, at a context in which work-related crises were important. Also, after an industrial crisis, there was quite an increase of service sector, which is still happening today, and that meant that women started to gain some momentum in the workspace, and also the population started getting old quickly. And I'm sure that the experts will tell you more about this, but this is the general context in which the pandemic, the coronavirus crisis, made an entrance, and this could have been quite a change, therefore, instilling new social demographic changes in our society after the first wave of changes. In Catalonia, we have something very special after more than 20 years of having municipalities pioneering time use policies, promoting this kind of initiatives in the local arena. I think it was in 2011 in which they agreed they signed the time use pact between Barcelona, Esplugues, and Terrassa and Sant Boi, I believe. And those changes have meant a reduction of working hours, even though we're still a far cry from other European scenarios such as France or Italy, in which the 35 hours a week are the norm. And all of this is being debated once again. Uh, Working hours, whether there should be a maximum amount of hours worked every week, 35 or 40, to devote time to other activities, obviously depending on the type of job what one has, but also to have time for mobility and to be able to adjust those working hours so that we don't live to work, but rather work to live and enjoy a lot of leisure time as well. So I'm sure that you, as representative of municipalities, have played a pivotal role in trying to manage and to adapt municipal policies of both cities, big and small. In every single case, obviously, one needs to adjust that policy to one's own characteristics. So maybe you would like to share with us the role that city councils have played during the pandemic. You are at the level of administration that's closest to citizens. You've been able to offer relief and support to your citizens within your scope, obviously, the kind of subsidies and support to fight this COVID crisis to your fellow citizens. And maybe this has included time use policies. So that proximity to the population is a pre-requirement, and it fits nicely with the current need and the current discussion in Europe, which is the need to network with other local experiences from other municipalities and learn from them. We hope that this session can be useful so that other municipalities and local departments of other cities in Catalonia can learn from one another, so that you're acquainted with these other experiences. And there might have been a specific decision in a given municipality about time use management, or space management facilities. And this could be of use for many of you. I'm sure that these will be a reality, and you'll be able to capitalize on other people's experiences. We'll also hear from the mayor of Beasain in the Basque Country. They will contribute a slightly different viewpoint from the kind of policies we're implementing in Catalonia. Without further ado, I will now give the floor to the Secretary of Local Administrations and Relations with the Aran Valley from the Catalan government, Miquel Angel Escobar. I will give him the floor so that he can tell us more about this kind of collaboration. Good morning. Thank you for inviting us as the as Catalan government to participate in this time use week. There's something you mentioned. You said that these starting a budding stage during the 80s, and this had to do with one of the crises that we have had to go through recently. There's no doubt that crises bring about very negative consequences, like the ones we're experiencing right now during the COVID crisis. But whenever we are in crisis, there are opportunities that arise, and probably the harsher the crisis one experiences, the more salient those opportunities are. And we've been working on notions for years now on policies that are still quite timid. They're not very wide in their scope, but once that window of opportunity opens, they become more likely to happen.
I think will be the case with time use policies. I don't know about you, but January this year feels like very long ago. So much has happened. In March, the pandemic uh, exploded in Catalonia. Um, the state of alarm changed a lot of things. And something that was mostly theoretical a few months earlier, such as telecommuting, suddenly became a practical reality. And governments at every level had to take on all of these things. So, something that was considered as an interesting possibility suddenly became a necessity. If we had to stay home, we had to organize our time, we had to telecommute, we had to do all sorts of things we had never uh, remembered. We had never considered. So, and then there are some certainties as well. So we've had to change the way we related to each other, the way we worked as well. We had to change our working hours, our time. So what's happening to time uh, is well has a lot of different perspectives. I mean, there are a lot of downsides, of course. It's had a terrible impact, but basically, there will probably be a growth in opportunities, not only because of the political will of the towns that wanted to have a bearing on time use, but because of a general sea change and a general need conveyed by citizens. And here, the role of local councils is crucial. No other level of government, neither central state nor the government of Catalonia, is in the same position to have a bearing on how uh, we take we seize the opportunity of this crisis in terms of time use, because local governments prescribe things. People in cities interpret transformations from what they perceive most immediately, and they rely on their local governments, which means that everything that can be done at the local government level is a transformation that will remain because it will be immediately grasped by the population. So we combine a theoretical framework with a practical element. Also, in local government, alliances can be formed that can be a bit more difficult to form on a country level. Agreements can be reached between local councils and social agents for retail or for employment or whatever. It's just easier on a local level than it is on a more general level. The general level will arrive after the local level has arrived at such agreements, but not before. It's not likely to happen before because different interests on a city level are more feasibly managed. The many different interests at play on a broader scale are more difficult. The role of the government of Catalonia in this context, then, when we talk about the Better Living Plan or other projects, is to help the move to a more general implementation of these agreements and practices that are being developed and fleshed out on a local scale. If we can't do this, if we can't support these policies that have a local impact on people, then we won't be able to really leverage the opportunity afforded by this crisis. And therefore, we need to have as much alignment as possible between what is being done on a local scale and what can be done by the government of Catalonia. In particular, in my case, from the person, my secretariat for local government. So the first step perhaps would be for the network of cities for time use reform to expand. If it could expand to all of Catalan towns, it would make a big difference, in terms of employment and many other things. We're experiencing a sea change. We need to leverage it. In order to do so properly, we really need to work hard to create an alliance between local government and other levels of government, but also and other stakeholders. And the fact is that local governments play a really important role here. And spaces will have to be created. They're hard to predict, but it will have to happen. And otherwise, we won't be able to seize the opportunity, unfortunately afforded by this terrible crisis. So the opportunity is there. Then there's another point. Uh, when we talk about territorial cohesion, spatial cohesion, that's very important. We have to combine uh, we have to combine time use matters with a kind of branding concept. Some towns don't need that, but for some towns it would make a big difference. Many people are reconsidering their lives and where they live and how they live in the midst of this crisis. So they might decide that they want to live in less peopled areas. If they have enough services and utilities and are able to telecommute, they could continue to work. And uh, that is where time use can make a difference and can be relevant to this kind of choice. So even in terms in terms of spatial cohesion, this matter of time use could become part of our branding as a nation. I just wanted to say this by way of example. And coming to the end of what I had to say to begin with, we really need to build a more stronger alliance between local levels because otherwise we won't manage to get where we could. Thank you, Michelangelo. I will now give the floor to the Mayor of San Boy, Luisa Moret. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for inviting us to this panel discussion within the seventh Time Use Week. The Time Use Week has become a consolidated time to exchange good practices and find ways to ensure that this really becomes a reference for all of Catalonia. I mean, that is something we really need to do. We have to consolidate and boost it. It is already. But in any case, we have to bear in mind all of the different kinds of people's times, work time, um, family time, shopping time, and so forth. I mean, it all has to be brought together. We have to create a balance. Otherwise, it will be terrible in the life of many women and many men. One point that's always important to bear in mind when we talk about time use policies is the gender perspective. The gender perspective has to be addressed, and any new policies have to address gender issues. Otherwise, we will simply be increasing existing imbalances in terms of time, for instance, time for caregiving, and so forth. There is clear inequality and a clear imbalance in terms of time use. Unless we take a gender perspective, we will continue to perpetuate the kind of discrimination and inequality and imbalance we have today. So we have to bear in mind that balance among different kinds of time is a right of citizens. So we need public policies. And I've also said that the gender perspective is needed. These are my two, or these are the two bases for our time use policies in my town, San Boy de Llobregat. As we said before the introduction, we were a pioneering local council in the early 20s, sorry, not the early 20s, in the early noughties. We were amongst the first to set up structures and policies. We created a local council department for time use, for instance, in 2007, because we were convinced that this whole matter had to be a significant part of our agenda. As Michelangelo mentioned, these policies and commitments cannot be as effective as they ought to be if they're piecemeal, one-off things. They shouldn't be merely local or merely municipal. They have to be done on a network basis because we're talking about citizens' rights and we're talking about balancing things. And of course, that is a sea change in both public and private life. And that takes time and that takes commitments and alliances and so forth. In yesterday's panel discussions, there was mention of the fact that we need to combine an international perspective, also provided by this Time Use Week, an overall perspective too, bringing a global perspective, bringing in people who look at sustainable development, and a local perspective. When you have you know, time, and looked at from the perspective of the individual experience of it all citizens at different moments in their lives. So we started working on this in 2007. We thought that we needed to reach an agreement between all or with all of the social and economic agents in our town, in our city. So we created a local compact for time which garnered the adhesion of over 300 agents, from the sphere of culture, the economy, and so on and so forth. And we've had focus areas since 2009, and we have different perspectives. One is the city perspective, another is an internal perspective as a council. We felt that the local council had to set an example and had to move forward according to the time use logic. So the city compact includes an internal plan for time use reform, and we've been implementing that. We've changed working hours or opening hours. We've changed arrangements with our coordination bodies. We've introduced agreed uh, flexibility for working hours with the trade unions. We've also set up common spaces so that we can rationalize meal times. That's also a big component. Changing meal times has a lot to do with time reform because we have very, very long working days here, split working hours with long lunch breaks. So we created certain spaces and reached agreement for greater flexibility in arrival time and departure time and many other projects as well. We also set up an internal group called Ubuntu, a group of employees to propose new ideas under the general umbrella of what we describe as organizational health, because of course all of this has to do with with health. This uh, this started in 2012, 2013, and even back then we started looking at telecommuting, including a digitization perspective. As Michelangelo said, we've all had to become digitized overnight because of the pandemic, so that the healthcare pandemic could be made compatible with our institutional and other responsibilities. I mean, that's had to be done. But we need to think about it because it's been a bit of a rush job, and therefore we've not been totally careful about the way we've gone about it. And we have to consider the impact it's had on our employees and especially the gender perspective, the gender imbalance. We've done some internal surveys and we've found that the balance of time for women and men has been different in the case of telecommuting. Now, we worked internally, but we also worked externally with all social agents, as I said earlier, especially the very local ones. As Michelangelo pointed out, we have to combine uh, the work on a local level with work on a country level. We supported the draft uh, project for time reform that was put to the Catalan parliament a few years ago, because of course our direct influence is what it is. In our local council, we've worked with with retail associations and with local consumers unions and so on and so forth. What we've done in conjunction with other towns is we've set up pilot experiences in rationalization of shop hours, of shopping hours or shop opening hours. And of course, there were some difficulties here because the retailers always pointed out the problem they had with the opening hours of major shopping centers, shopping malls, and the like, because they felt that they were making an effort in having more streamlined opening hours, but then that was causing them to lose a competitive edge compared to malls. Then there's a matter of public services. We've rationalized the opening hours of city services so that they're more compatible with personal life. We've also streamlined certain things, or reached streamlining arrangements with some companies based in our town. So we've shared in all these experiences, we've held all of these experiences, but we don't want them to just remain at the pilot stage. What we want them is to become mainstreamed in business, in retail, and so forth. No. So, as we've done in the local council. Mhm. I don't know how I'm doing for time, but lastly, in this compact, we have really emphasized public space and the relationship between public space and time. The two are very closely intertwined, and public facilities too. There was a neighborhood that was affected by the Neighborhood Act, and we introduced a pilot scheme within it that was a consideration of time issues for the for the residents of that neighborhood. So, we surveyed women and men and people at different times in the reproductive cycle so that everybody could give feedback on that matter. And we saw that the use of many public facilities and services is different between men and women, and also between generations.
And also adopting all of these public policies to the specific moment, as well as from a gender perspective, an age-related perspective, and others that require further study. And I'm saying this because it is extremely important. Public policies of the 20th century, especially in democratic city councils, focused on adapting the public space so that it could be of the highest quality for the well being and peaceful coexistence of our citizens. Whereas in this century, we will focus more on time use policies. So, first space and then time, and both need to intertwine. Uh, we have been active in several projects from that point of view, mostly on the right time for these projects. For instance, sports facilities. Many people mentioned that as part of this work life balance, uh, women sometimes got personal time with family time confused. They didn't speak about leisure time for themselves, but rather their free time was devoted mostly to their family because of this sense of guilt that they were not paying enough attention to their families. Whereas when men spoke of their own time, that meant just for them to play some sports, to spend time with their colleagues, play soccer in this particular district. So we realized there was quite a distinction between how men and women, experienced time differently. It's just an example that I'm sharing with you, and I believe we need to continue to explore it. So let me finish by saying that finally, we need to socialize this whole discussion about time use and time use reform, because up until now, debates such as this one have been quite institutional or academic in nature, how experts talk to one another, which is positive, obviously, but this hasn't trickled down yet to the lay population. Uh, Cities are only aware that they're not able to strike that balance, and they believe this to be a personal issue, not a collective one. So I believe that public institutions and local administrations that, as you said, are closer to the reality of our citizens, we need to place this issue in the social debate, in the community debate, so that citizens themselves understand that this is a collective issue and that it requires public policies to solve this. Otherwise, everyone suffers from this in silence individually instead of understanding that it's a common agenda. Many women have told us, what Agarthe, this great feminist writer, calls this gender chasm, this feeling that when you're in one place, you feel you should be somewhere else, and you're never quite satisfied with your role because it's very difficult to render all of this compatible. So I believe that it is not only a gender issue. There are a lot of men, an increasing number of men that are more and more aware about how these kind of private responsibilities should be shared as well. That's it for me. I don't want to take up too much time. Let me just say that the role of city halls is key, but it has to be widely coordinated as part of a broader program. These are structural changes. They require commitment and investment over the long run. And these kind of changes need to follow this logic of time management as a citizen's right. Thank you. Thank you, Louisa, for bringing to the table this gender viewpoint. And now we will give the floor to Aitor Abasara, who's the mayor of Beasain in Gipuzkoa province, who's been invited to be part of this roundtable as well. Good morning. Well, first and foremost, I would like to thank you for inviting us to this meeting. And I'd like to congratulate you as well. I think this is quite a feat. Obviously, if we were able to meet personally on site, it would be even more of a pleasure. But now that we are starting to work on these kind of policies, to be able to exchange all of our projects with you is paramount. I believe in the role of local institutions, as Miguel Angel has already underlined. We can show the way, we can be opinion leaders, and these obviously can influence segments of the population um, that sometimes do not receive this kind of messages from any other institution. We are firm believers in the fact that we're not talking solely about time use changes, but rather to take on shared responsibility. This kind of co-responsibility, as it has been brought up, is not only a woman's issue, but men as well. I mean, there's no other way. We need to see it from that viewpoint as well and try to be part of the change. I believe that in our day to day, it's funny because when you spoke about work management, in the past, we didn't see much problem in it. But now that we speak about how to manage time and leisure time, particularly, we find it so difficult. In the project that we're working on, i- it is part of the first plan of the provincial government of Gipuzkoa for this shared responsibility in work-life balance. We believe it is indispensable to compile data, to carry out the necessary tests. We have the experience. We, as the city councils, have signed agreements with a lot of different organizations. And there are a lot of examples that you've been implementing for years now in other countries, such as Catalonia. They can be extremely useful for us so that we can move on. Many of your projects are quite ambitious. For instance, the fact that there's a threshold after which no meetings can be held, well, there's still a long way for us from that point of view. But we are very passionate about this project of the provincial plan for a co-responsible work-life balance. So we are willing to be a pilot municipality for this kind of project. So we're talking about 14,000 people in Guipúzcoa with a very strong industrial sector. There are companies with 2,500 people, then smaller companies as well. Obviously, businesses differ in terms of size, and after the first diagnoses have been carried out, we have mapped our reality based on real data, and we can see that 90% of our companies already have work balance policies as part of their daily operation. It is very important for those data to be well known. It's not an opinion. 98% of the work and life balance measures that are offered to employees are only seized by women. They are the ones who call for these kind of changes and try to reconcile their work and personal life. These are not just opinions, these are sheer data. So it is the time for us to implement the next stages, the next steps of that project, of that pilot project, to promote this co-responsible work-life balance. Now, our goal is to promote changes and new dynamics that can facilitate the balance between a family life, work, as well as personal development in a more balanced way, both for men and women. So it would be interesting for us to have the ability, as part of this action plan, to work from different fields. We believe that an action plan is not a project that has to be implemented only by means of the law, as it has been the case until now. So if a company fulfills some requirements or complies with specific measures, they can receive a subsidy, let's say. No, we believe that this has to be all encompassing, big companies, but also in the sports team, the people who play soccer in a district all day long, from the time you wake up until when you go back home in the evening. um, when you go to school to take your kids, there's an organization there that will take care of your child, and then probably that child has to go to an after school event, let's say. So I believe that the way we see it, it's not only about time management, it goes much further than that. So as I said, we started conducting a diagnosis, an assessment of the current situation. We focused on a population of men and women on equal footing. That diagnosis told us that the population that we considered dependent, that meant the elderly and children, they amounted to 25%. So that's an important percentage. 60% active population, probably more for men. Before the pandemic, there was 7% unemployment in this municipality. So it's a structural unemployment rate. So we understood, together with the provincial government, that this type of municipality with very strong organizations, associations, very powerful business structure, a very active municipality, um, enjoying street life or leisure activities. So it was the right one for this study. We moved past the assessment. Obviously, the COVID crisis stopped us in our tracks. But once this assessment was carried out, as well as the action plan, the next step in the process, which we should be implementing, we understand that when we come back to normal, this will be the case. would be to work with some companies as in this pilot stage, as well as associations. They can be sports, arts clubs. We have already identified several of them as key players because a lot of people participate in their activities. Therefore, there's a more certain leeway to play around with the different time uses, and we can achieve a better work-life balance. So, as a next step, we will try to combine those activities and that leisure time with working hours, with work-related time, so that people at home or at work um, can achieve that kind of balance much better, and they can take on that shared responsibility as well. We believe that we have made the best of our time during the pandemic as well. This has been quite important. It was an arduous task to work on work life balance as part of the city council staff as well. We have a local decree instructing telecommuting for our own employees. We've been able to distribute the work amongst all of our employees. So one knows that on a given day, regardless of the specific stage of the pandemic, it is possible as part of the city council to work from your own home. And that meant that during this pandemic, while we were at home, we continued to hone our tools and to improve these mechanisms, both IT resources, because obviously we understand that there are a lot of such devices at home that need to be at the right level to be able to telecommute the way the way one thinks, let's say, because it's quite a change in mindset when you need to change your habit and when to clock in and clock out. You need to have specific targets you want to hit, and we can see that there are a lot of employees that are working longer hours than they should. So if we move towards a more target-oriented model with shared responsibilities, I believe this will be more efficient. We come from a culture in which there was no end to our working hours every day. Mm, People are showing, let's say, their best behavior. They're very willing to change that, to adjust that, even though we don't yet have that culture of how to work within city councils. We're very pleased to see that people really want to change that model and to work on the basis of specific targets. I won't deny that this is difficult. Um, there are a lot of people who are agile and flexible, but when telecommuting, we can see that there are a lot of people reluctant to change, and it's being quite a hurdle. We obviously would love to see those goals turned into reality. Uh, we need to follow specific guidelines, just like when you take, let's say, vacation time, you take a leave. If you leave for a couple of weeks, well, you need to telecommute. You need to fill out a form with specific targets, and then you need the permission of the specific person heading that department. We are happy with that step. More than 80% of the city council employees consider this change as advantageous. And as I said already, it's a change in our model, in our culture. And we believe that that's the way forward. There's no other possibility. We're talking about co-responsible work-life balance. These are the tools we have at our disposal right now. I think it was Michelangelo who said this. City councils themselves, civil servants, have the tools, and they need to show everybody else that it's a possibility. Thank you, Aitor. We will now give the floor to finish with this first round to Jordina Freixenet, who is a deputy mayor and in charge of institutional quality of the City Council in Lleida. Thank you. Thank you for inviting us to participate and to share the experience of Lleida. I'd like to begin by saying something that, albeit obvious, it is important for us to stress this. Uh, this is the time for time use reform, and this is what our mayor said last week during a conference. He said, "We've discovered that we are vulnerable against the backdrop of this COVID crisis, so we need to make the most of this new model and this opportunity to tackle political reforms that have been delayed for some time now." So we are here with all of these colleagues to tell you about our experience in Lleida as along this path towards a time use reform and the time use pact. We believe in this healthy city of Lleida. For some time now, we've been thinking about time use reform, work life balance, a more female way of working in talk shows, in the parliament, as our colleagues were just saying, yeah, as part of this panel discussion. In October 2016, the plenary of our city council adopted by unanimity a request of the Group of Lleida as an organization in favor of the time use reform, and with the approval of that motion, we started holding a day devoted to time use reform in Lleida. And every year we've held this event in November. It is one of the driving forces of our city to continue to fight for this time use reform. And the members of this organization are indeed role models. They keep working day by day in silence in order to exert pressure on all kinds of institutions so that we can all take a stance and be champions of work-life balance policies and move towards a more responsible city with this kind of time policies because they're very necessary.
And then 1 year later, in 2017, the president of the Catalan government, Carles Puigdemont, proposed the Catalan for compact for time use reform to different levels all over Catalonia. And the mayor of Lleida adhered to this, which was yet another commitment to work towards our goal in 2025. But of course, agreements on paper need to happen in people's actual lives. There are three parties that are the ruling coalition in Lleida, and it was decided amongst these parties to really turn all of this into real action. As of the election in 2019, there was the agreement of San Juan, which is a platform shared between the three coalition parties, which might not seem to have a lot of objectives in common. So the San Juan agreement includes involving the stakeholders, especially retailers, and formalizing the adhesion of the City Council of Mayor's office. And well, we've been the ruling coalition for about a year and a half, and we will soon be signing an agreement with the Barcelona Time Use Initiative. So we'll be adhering to complete what Slow Shop Lleida initiated in 2016 with its proposal. We want Lleida to be a reference point for time use and also to learn from you other towns that are further ahead of us. We will be working in four stages. First, we'll draw up an initial document and create a driving group. Then we will have uh, working groups made up of experts. Because of COVID, we've also addressed the possibility of making these panel working groups virtual or partly so. And the third is a implementation, and then fourth of well presentation of results and agreement. So our current agreement will be in force for a year, and it will be spearheaded by the mayor's office. And it's important to bear this in mind. Since retail was the driving force in the first place, we will have some specific measures for different retail sectors. We cannot move forward with this without the support of our retailers, which we have placed at the center of our time use reform. As they have described it, time use reform has to be an opportunity for retailers, small retailers especially, and their associations are very clear about that. The mayor told us recently that about the unfair practices of shopping malls and the like. But the way we see this is very different. We see it as an opportunity to change the paradigm, to create the slow shop brand and concept, with the idea that this kind of slow shopping is good to people and good for time. The document of the Catalan government talked about humanizing retail hours, which means that shopping hours should be between 7 a.m. and 7:30 p.m. so that we can adjust shopping hours also to the challenges of a diverse society. Well, we have taken on this challenge. In 2019, over 200 shops adhered to the initiative. We believe that together with the retail fabric of our city, we will be able to implement this kind of reform. In over the 4 short years between 2016 and 2020, what was originally promoted by just the retail sector is now a citywide thing. Another document titled "Yay the Feminist City" was approved last December, and the last item in this document talked about reaching social agreements to combine caregiving time with paid work time and family and personal time. Because we cannot deny the fact that with time use reform, we're trying to change the patriarchate. And beyond the Yay the Feminist Town agreement, we have another compact that we reached, well, an agreement that we reached with a lot of trade unions and a lot of different sectors in our town. There is an imperative need right now, as mentioned by the Secretary General. Um, uh, a, there's a bottom up movement of citizens asking us to do whatever it takes to make individual issues social measures. We want Lleida to be a city that is close to the heart of people, and we're determined to make this all happen. More than ever, this is a golden opportunity to promote rational living hours, more similar to those of our European neighbors. Rita Rivas, who represented the doctors of Catalonia in the panel for time use reform in Catalonia, pointed out how work is really patterning our day in an unhealthy manner. So we need to bring this change to all institutions and people. We have to find a way to allocate time so that we can be more productive, sleep better, eat better, and reconcile our personal and family life and leisure life with work so that we're ultimately all happier. We'll keep saying that all of this, the feminization, time use agreement and compact and so forth, and all of our public policies in 2021 will be all about meeting this challenge we have as a city. Thank you very much, Jorlina, for that presentation. We've received two questions about this first part of the session. We can, well, since there are two of them, we can devote, say, 5 minutes to each one. So we'll allocate 10 minutes altogether to these questions. The first question is from Veronica Artera of the town of Caldas de Montbui. She talks about the diagnosis and design of time use policies, which are essential. But her question is, how do you assess your implemented time use policies? So, what is your assessment of the policies you've already implemented or the policies that you know others have implemented? So, if you feel like answering this question, all and or any of you can answer, and then we'll go on to the second one. Well, I can start. Veronica, you're quite right. We often have gaps in the data. Before we can assess whether we're doing well, we need a lot more data. I'm obsessive about data. I'm in charge of open government too, so that's also a factor. We're trying to collect a lot of data and keep them up to date too. Time can determine our lifetime, just how long we live, but can also have an impact on all sorts of daily things. So we want data about social use, educational use, use of municipal facilities, and the time factor is now being included there. We're bringing in new kinds of data. It used to be that we didn't include gender. Now we have gender, and now time will also be a factor that we will be recording so that whenever the time comes to review a public policy, we can consider what impact we're having on time. For instance, in our sports policies, if we don't consider gender and time, we don't know how we're doing. So we're the local council that's joined the process, that last. So we hope we can bring this on board swiftly. Yeah, over where Charlena left off, I say that data are very important to assess the impact of any public policy. We need to do more to have more information. But in addition to this, we also need more time. Not enough time has gone by, although some town councils have really pioneered this matter and can provide some figures that can reflect whether the changes have been welcome or not, and so on and so forth. But the fact is that these very deep reaching, cultural, cross cutting kinds of change require data, of course, but they require time. First, for the data to be collected, but also for the changes to become consolidated. Because once some things are consolidated, then further discussion, further needs can arise. And so we'll also need time to analyze the depth of the changes underway and try and channel them. And since we're living in a very fast society, much faster than it was 50 years ago, leaving aside present events, we tend to assume that social change is fast. But but it but in fact, social change, while it might appear to be fast, actually takes a lot of time. Would Luisa or Aitor like to add anything? The next question is from Adriana Ronda of Comisiones Obreras, a trade union. Since cities have a key role in time use, perhaps cities should have more jurisdiction. They should have more powers on these matters. For Aitor, I will clarify that the question is, since cities have a key role in time use, do you think cities should have more jurisdiction, more powers? I don't think Luisa and Aitor are still here. Oh, okay then. Well, maybe Michelangelo and Jordina, would you like to answer this question from Adriana Alonso? Okay, this is going to be a personal answer rather than one representing my institution. I think local councils should have much broader jurisdiction, perhaps in a complementary manner. I mean, some things need to be decided on a statewide level, some things need to be decided on a regional level, and some things need to be decided on a local level. Some policies, we do need a general framework for them, but you can have the general framework which can be driven from the top, but 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 the general framework has also to be based on the trials and projects done on a local scale. I mean, for instance, the matter of shopping hours. Well, the regulation of shopping hours is not in theory up to local council, but in fact, their experience has to be taken on board. I don't think anything can done overall without some town councils actually first seizing the initiative. I agree. Uh, this all began in 2016, as I pointed out, with a unanimous plenary agreement. We've had three different mayors in the intervening time, but they've all agreed on this. So there's a lot of unanimity around it, and that means that it's easy to reach strategic city-wide agreements. Sometimes it's really frustrating when there is widespread support at the local level by all different bodies and different stakeholders. Um, a number of companies are able to ignore this kind of approach. So, does there need to be a law for shopping hours? Well, yes, maybe that can be done on the Catalan level, but maybe that law could allow for citywide agreements to have more specific local w- opening hours. I mean, otherwise, you end up creating a dual city when in actual fact the city overwhelmingly supports one model and not a combination of the two. I mean, you could make introduce all sorts of requirements such as the support of the two-thirds of local councillors, for instance. But I mean, the compacts require a lot of widespread support from different sectors and different stakeholders and so on and so forth. And of course, this level of detail, this level of support garnering is not something that is easy to encode by law, and nevertheless, it would make plenty of sense for issues such as this for local government to have that jurisdiction. Okay, so now we'll have the second part of the session. We'll hear from Angel Pucci-Volta, Counselor for Economic Promotion of the town of Argentona. Can you hear me? Okay, thank you. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to take part in this event. This is part of a commitment of our town, which is in line with the logic defended by the preceding speakers. The town of Argentona is also committed to this kind of approach. The commitment began in 2015. It was quite bold to take on the challenge back then, considering
And a lot of contradictions have surfaced. We've seen some wake up calls about some of the things that might not work in this new scenario. In many cases, we haven't been doing actual telecommuting. We've just worked from home, and we have had to find a balance between our personal family life, which was quite different because all members of the family were at home, all trying to do their work, their study time, etc., and trying to find a way to for all of this to fit, and also to raise children and sometimes help them study or educate them. So we've been working remotely, which is slightly different. We have had to quickly adopt these changes, which is dangerous, and that is why uh, the law that regulates telecommuting should help us understand that there are still a lot of things to be done, and we should do our best to avoid these problems that are now arising. It's been a rapid change in our working habits, so it's only natural that these things are appearing now. A couple more thoughts about telecommuting. Telecommuting is possible in many cases, but not in all scenarios. Same thing goes for some work life balance measures. If we talk about time management, we cannot just think about having more compact working hours or finishing at a given time, because, especially in big cities, but not only, we all as citizens have our own needs and they go way beyond our working hours because they connect to other people's working hours. I'm talking about leisure itself. We're thinking about going to enjoy shows, going to the theater, sports concerts, going to a restaurant. There are people who work there and therefore have a different working schedule. Or we could speak about care services. Obviously, in this field, they are at the front line working with their users, and there are a lot of changes from the care field because it impacts our health, but also our elder population. These people don't just stop working; they need to work around the clock in hospitals and this kind of institutions.
beyond those 8 working hours of official working time. But leaving aside all that, we do have to find solutions for the sectors that cannot telecommute or cannot have standard working hours. And this also needs to be made compatible with the present economic model, which asks us to be flexible in terms of time use. Companies that are demanding of their employees availability around the clock, pretty much. Work on demand with the impact that has in personal time management and work life balance. So I think we're dealing with a huge change. Um, there are changes in every sphere, including mobility. The pandemic has also made it quite clear But it's important to look at how we get around and how we get to work. So we've also reached agreements with companies to try and make sure that not everyone is commuting at exactly the same time, and not everybody's driving, trying to promote the use of public transport and so forth, so that we have a more sustainable city, environmentally sustainable and also sustainable in terms of the people who make up the ecosystem. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Raquel. And this list of guests from the different towns of Catalonia talking about these matters will be Ferran Bertran, the representative of the sports section or department of the City Council of Girona. Thank you for inviting us. We want the transition to be as little traumatic as possible. For instance, in the sphere of culture, we have earlier hours for concerts and events in the in the city auditorium and theater. Can you hear me better now? Is it better? And then, so Sunday evening events have been moved up to 7 p.m. instead of whatever they were earlier. So all of these things are trying to help facilitate change in other areas. This was important. We also want to help spectators, showgoers. The response has been quite good. We surveyed the audiences and found that we didn't lose an audience and that people were actually happy with these hours. Something else is, as others have mentioned, that the idea is that not everybody should be on exactly the same working hours, but working hours need to be complementary. And of course, everything has to be combined with other factors. I mean, what time we have the evening meal can also clash with the opening hours of small retail shops and large shopping malls, which can have a huge impact on small and medium-sized cities, as others have said. And then we have, the opening hours of cultural facilities such as libraries and so on and so forth. We want those to be also compatible with family life, considering that much of the public using libraries is made up of women. While we're waiting for questions from our audience, I would like to start the ball rolling with a question of my own to try and others earlier have mentioned that local governments are the level of government that's closest to citizens and therefore perhaps the level that can, in best practical terms, bring aid and support to citizens. Do you think you have room for that? Do you think, or would you like the government of Catalonia or the government of Spain to give you more room for maneuver in this regard? And do you expect or hope this to be addressed at the end of the pandemic? Do you expect yourselves as local governments to be the ones to manage this kind of social support? Because since you're the level of government closest to people, it's the first one that people resort to. Yes, local government is often the first level of government that is addressed by citizens. And so if we have more autonomy, we can do more about things directly. Otherwise, we end up just channeling people, telling them, okay, go here or go there. But I think it would be good for us all to be working in coordination towards a common goal because sometimes we are not quite coordinated. And I think that's the key. I fully agree with what Adam said. We have to consider the role and opinion of cities when policies are drawn up so that the policies can have a real impact. Without this kind of preparation, some measures can become really difficult to implement. And so potentially high impact actions just never come to fruition. So cooperation amongst different levels of government is always important, but at a time like this, when there's even more need for coordination than ever, it's especially important, and we need resources to reach the people who need them the most in the best way possible. Go ahead, Michelangelo. Do you want to add anything to that? I'm sorry, but I my connection was dropped because of a mistake, so I wasn't able to follow these last few minutes. The question was, Angel, whether you town councils feel that you have enough resources or whether you need more support or resources from the government of Catalonia or from the government of Spain to provide direct support to your residents. And do you expect that the pandemic will change the present status? Obviously, towns would always like to have more resources, clearly, but the question is whether this present healthcare, social, and economic crisis might lead ultimately to towns having more resources in order to provide access to support and resources for residents. Can you hear me properly? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yes, yes, we hear you perfectly. Yeah, well, certainly we always need resources and there's always a shortfall. It might seem that we're always asking for more resources to address needs. This pandemic has had perhaps a positive impact on some time use reform aspects, but had a more negative impact on other. We've had to reallocate uh, some budgetary items in order to address the needs that have emerged as a result of COVID-19. And then, in the context of the pandemic, some shops that had committed to time use reform have abided by their required opening hours, and we're very grateful to them. But the fact is that the pandemic has had quite an impact in homes and quite an impact in economic activities. So we'd be very grateful for more resources. And I have to say very clearly that we're very grateful to the provincial council and the government of Catalonia for all the support provided. So anything that can be done to improve the situation with COVID is important. And and we are grateful for the way that a lot of people have abided by the time use reform rules. I'm sure all towns need further support if they can get it. I'm sure all of them do, but we certainly need our share. So now Michelangelo Escobar, the Secretary of the Catalan government for local government and relationships with Iran, might have something to do about all this, or might have something to say. I mean, okay, there are two debates here. One is about resources, and the other is about powers or jurisdiction. It's it's one thing to ask for resources, another to ask for responsibilities. I hear local councils asking for resources. They're not necessarily asking for the ensuing responsibilities, and sometimes it's part of the same package. What I want to say is that what we need at this time of emergency is maximum cooperation. Political parties have to compete, but governments must cooperate, especially at a time like this, with a terrible health crisis that has a social and economic impact as well. The government of Catalonia has a shortfall in resources just like local councils have. It happens at every level. But let me say one little thing. Here in the presidency and the secretariat for local government, one thing that's very clear to us is that local governments, local councils are essential. And that's why we adopted certain measures. We prioritized economic cooperation with towns. I mean, not just policies and words and so forth. We wanted to provide practical support. And that's why, over between this year and the next, we will be injecting into local government just about the same amount we were previously allocating to the local cooperation fund, which means we're pretty much doubling it. But the thing is, the local level may find that it's that it can't handle a certain volume. I mean, there are so many extra things that need to be handled that you might find that there are just too many people knocking at your doors because demand is and will be very high, which means you need the structure to manage all of this and economic resources, obviously, to meet the needs. From our perspective, it's better for the resources to be available at the front line, in other words, with you, rather than for them to be managed directly by us. But this ties in with a different debate, which is about administrative reform. Are you aware of this ironic paradox? Before the administration could be made to work by objectives, we've had to have a state of alarm. We've had to suspend freedoms before we could suddenly have many more ICUs in hospitals, hired people needed for certain tasks, and so on and so forth. Now we no longer have a state of alarm, and so we're back to the usual form of administration, which is very sluggish and hard to get to react. And that is also a source of frustration. Sometimes the problem is not lack of resources per se, as much as the ability to get them where they're needed, when they're needed in a timely manner. So that's a separate debate, a parallel debate, but it's relevant to what we're saying because this cross cutting, all encompassing crisis we're experiencing is one in which government needs to be rethought as well. Otherwise, the speed that I mentioned, I don't think Raquel quite followed what I'd been saying about time. I was referring to analysis and assessment. Decisions do need to be made as swiftly as possible. I just want to clarify that. But as you pointed out, some decisions or some policies are formulated so swiftly that it's dangerous too because there are some side effects that haven't been addressed or considered. In any case, we're running out of time. And it's true that sometimes to do things properly, you just need more time or better time management. Something else I would like to contribute here. The apparent contradiction between uh, a framework agreed on a local level that is incompatible with the overall legislation and regulations. When we need to consider how government works. We need to think about how we apply general rules to singularities. We have a lot of diversity in Catalonia. We have a large city, a huge city like Barcelona, and we have small, very small towns and villages. So, in terms of deciding what municipalities are able or not to do, we also have to think of legal certainty. When we've tried to implement very surgical policies, as it were, then there are generalized widespread complaints. But when you implement very generalized policies across the board, then you're having negative impacts in all sorts of smaller sectors. And that's something you have to deal with. Sort of uniform policies can cause in huge imbalances and inequalities, and uh, ultra tailored policies can also uh, cause a perception of privilege. And it's not easy to strike the right balance, especially not at a time of crisis and emergency. Thank you. We're waiting for questions, but I don't know if Raquel might want to say something to what's been said before. Well, thank you. I'm not going to launch an argument with Miguel Angel. He and I have discussed these matters time and time again. But there is one thing that I would like to say. Some issues have traditionally been linked to gender issues and equality, and therefore they were not given the importance they should have been given. And another point, our governments have lots of responsibilities, have a lot to do, and they're often a bit sluggish. As Michelangelo pointed out, the emergency has made it possible to make certain efforts and change certain things. But as mentioned earlier, some things are here to stay and some are not. I think this rapid response capability of government should be here to stay. We should really work to ensure that we can move forward not only in terms of time use policies, but also in terms of just better organization of government, which also has an impact on time use because anything that's slower uses up more time of the administered people, the governed people, as well as everyone else. I think it was either Georgina or Louisa who mentioned time use policies earlier. I think we have more and more of more and more support for time use change because more and more people realize the impact it has in their lives. But if we do this, we have to do this in every sphere of public action. We have to take it into account when we adopt legislation on shop opening hours, but also when we agree on the school calendar or on leisure policies or on retail shopping hours, generally speaking, or even labor legislation on certain things.
Practices that are adopted that impact working hours. So, if we add that gender perspective to all of our activities, as well as all kinds of public policies, I am sure that at the end of this process, our administrations will be closer to citizens and we will become swifter and more nimble. Okay. So I have a question for Elena, and you could all try to give it an answer. I'll give you 2 to 3 minutes each. Ellen's question is: what kind of support can you envisage needing from the supra local level and from the global agenda as well? And she's asking whether you'd like to be part of the European Municipalities Network for time use. So, a couple minutes each. And that'll be the end of the time allotted for this session. So whoever wants to take the floor, feel free to do it. Well, I'm not sure. I believe that we at the City Council of Barcelona are already part of this European network for time use. Actually, we are working towards an international convention next year in 2021 from the academic point of view. And this international commitment is already there. Talking about SDGs, as I said earlier, we are reinforcing this being part of other networks such as Eurocities, which is another European forum for cities working on social and economic aspects, and it helps us keep networking and become stronger. So it's what I said earlier. We need to coordinate efforts amongst different administrations and cities and regions and countries as well, so that we can all take up these challenges together. The only possibility, respectful solutions, obviously there are other solutions as well, but the most respectful of them all is to bear in mind the role of all members and work on co-creation, pacts, and this shared responsibility. I think it's very important for all of us. Angel or Michelangelo, whoever would like to take the floor, this final round. Sure. Argentina, as a town, would love to be part of this European network. We believe that this can be extremely positive because sometimes we might make mistakes. I don't think we did, but uh, we have used as a reference a time bank that is managed by many municipalities, but being part of a broader project, a European network, I'm sure this would be a very enriching experience. And secondly, what is it that we could use or receive from other supra municipal institutions, you asked? I believe that the time use reform has a very local implementation. And as I said earlier, it is very important. It has been brought up several times. It's very important for all of us to come to an agreement. The different institutions at higher and governmental levels, they need to send that message as well that a reform is possible. I understand Raquel's words when she said that we're asking for time to implement this time reform, and it shouldn't take that long. I agree. When she mentioned those words, I thought she was right. Maybe we should speed up this whole process so that this time reform can be implemented. We need to come to it faster. And I don't think we need to base this on economic considerations. Obviously, money is needed to implement this reform, but I think it has to come from a voluntary commitment to work in terms of politicians, but also from higher levels of government. So any kind of support will be welcome based on this general agreement as a country. I think this is extremely positive. So we'll be more than happy to be part of this network. We'll see how this can come about and from any kind of support that comes our way. Thank you. Is it my turn? Yes, Michelangelo, go ahead. Well, we cannot be against being part of a European network in principle. I'll just mention a requirement. It is very important for big cities to be part of it, but obviously the kind of leadership role that they need to play. It is very important because we're talking about big influential metropolitan areas in general terms, and they all need to be there. In the case of Barcelona, it is a capital city of its country, always looking towards Europe. So Barcelona can no longer think about implementing a time use reform in its own jurisdiction and only for its 1.6 million people. This is unthinkable. This is a countrywide proposal, a countrywide project. There are other cities as well in Catalonia, but this is uh, our country, and it's not only based on one single metropolitan area. We have a huge diversity of municipalities, towns, and cities of all kinds, and that should be a value as well. It should be an asset. When cities want to be part of this European network, it's only natural, they should be able to represent not only their own goals and views, but also the common um, ideas that we defend here in Catalonia, and with the support of our governments as well, with the right institutional support. Why is this important? Well, the network helps us broaden our support, and it's becoming broader and broader, but it needs a certain foundation because apparently everything's changing right now. But it could happen for the first time ever that we feel everything's changing and nothing does. So I've changed the way I work. Instead of being at an office, I'm working from home. And apparently everything is very different. Maybe we've just become a bit digital, we've changed our channels, and that's it. And the business cultural logic and that impact trade and gender, health, they still are the way they were. So apparently everything changes or nothing does. So these kind of networks are key so that these changes, these partnerships that obviously should be bottom up, can become more consolidated over the short or long run. Raquel, I'm sure that we can come to an agreement about that. And there might be something missing here because I get the feeling sometimes that mm, maybe because many of us are of a certain age and are becoming a bit more frail, we might think that we're imposing something on a generation that haven't made any decision about their time use. I think that many of us have children. We know that this whole discussion about the time offered to TV shows and late night shows and stuff like this is relative because the way that young people consume TV shows and programs is completely different. So TV stations are no longer central in most households. We might resort to it now and then, but they are not as essential as in the past. So we need to also add to this network and to this whole process younger people. I'm not sure if I should call them millennials or X generation, Y generation, or whatever they're called these days, but they need to have a role because otherwise we will end up imposing our desired culture onto the next generation. Obviously, we'll end up deciding over that. And this might be seen as an imposition. And there's been a historic evolution, and maybe these young people want to change that, or maybe they don't. I think that's it. I'm not sure if I took up too much time, but these were some of the ideas I wanted to throw at you before we finish. Okay, so I would like to thank the three speakers as well as everyone else who've participated, Luisa Moret and Marcelo. Um, and everyone who've played a role in this roundtable discussion of Catalan municipalities for time use reform and time use policies. And I would add in the time of the coronavirus crisis, because it has played quite a role in this discussion as well. I think that we've touched upon very interesting topics, not only time and resources, but also the gender perspective. When we talk about time use policies, we tend to think about flexibility and time resources, and we tend to forget about the gender perspective, which is again impacted by this gender divide and the distinction that is still present, unfortunately, between men and women. Thank you all for your time, no pun intended. Thank you for participating in this discussion. I'm sure that the experiences of your city councils can be extremely useful to one another. And I think it's interesting that we finished with a representative from the Catalan government, another one from a big city council such as Barcelona, and then an elected official from a small town. Um, it's been extremely enriching for everyone. At least that's what we hope. That's it for us. Thank you, and see you in the next session. Thank you. Thanks.